in the heart of the Arabian sands, where the horizon has no end, and every grain of dust holds a fragment of memory, there lies a road that time itself has forgotten. Once caravans crossed it, bearing silk, salt, and stories, leaving only the faint echo of footsteps behind. Tonight we follow those echoes. Beneath a sky vast enough to erase names, through a world where the wind whispers in ancient tongues, we walk the same path as those who came before, led by Haris ibn Marwan, a man who sought meaning in the silence between dunes. This is not just a journey through sand. It is a journey through memory, through faith, and through the quiet endurance of the human spirit. So close your eyes. Let the rhythm of the camels and the hush of the wind carry you beyond the noise of the waking world. Breathe slowly. Feel the warmth of the desert night. You are entering the desert that remembers. Before we begin, if you enjoy these journeys through history and silence, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. My name is not important. Out here, names fade faster than footprints in the wind. Still, you may imagine me as a man with sand in his beard and silence in his eyes. Someone who has walked the long roads between Basra and the empty quarter so many times that he can no longer tell where one journey ended and the next began. I've lived my life with the caravans. They are my home, my work, my only prayer. Some men build houses of brick and cedar. I have built mine out of footsteps. Each season begins the same way. Before dawn, when the stars are still cold and bright, the city of Basra breathes in its sleep. We gather by the eastern gate, drivers, guards, merchants, beasts. The smell of tar and salt still clings to everything. The river's breath mixes with that of the desert waiting beyond. Someone counts the camels, someone checks the ropes, someone mumbles the first prayer of the morning. Then, when the first pale line of gold touches the domes of the city, we begin to move. The sound of a caravan leaving is unlike anything else. It is soft, a rhythm more felt than heard, the dull pad of hooves, the creak of leather, the sigh of wind against cloth. No drums, no horns, no shouting, only the hush of men who know they are about to enter a world that does not forgive noise. People in the cities imagine the desert as endless and simple, just sand and sky. They are wrong. The desert is alive. It breathes. It shifts. It hides. It listens to every careless word. One wrong sentence, one boastful laugh, and it will remind you how small you are. I have seen men vanish here without a trace. Sometimes the wind covers their tracks in an hour. Sometimes the dunes swallow their tents whole. When we find them days later, there is nothing left but a scrap of cloth and the faint smell of sweat baked into sand. Yet we return every season, because something in the desert calls us, a promise we can't name, a silence we need to hear again. The work is simple to describe, but endless to live. We load the camels before sunrise. Each beast carries water, food, goods for trade, silk from Persia, salt from the Gulf, glass from Syria, spices that smell of rain and wood. Every knot must be tight, every strap checked twice. A single mistake can unravel a fortune. The ropes bite our palms, the sun scorches our backs, and still we hum old songs to keep our hands from trembling. Water is everything. You learn to measure your thirst against your fear. Each man carries his share in a goatskin bag, and we all listen to the sound it makes when we lift it. If it sloshes loudly, we are safe. If it whispers, we are in danger. When it grows silent, completely silent, we begin to count the days backward. There are rules every caravan man knows. Walk at dawn, rest at noon, move again at sunset. Never chase a mirage. Never drink alone. Never mock the wind. It carries memory and sometimes voices. I remember my first journey. I was 17, full of pride and questions. The older men laughed softly when I asked what the desert looked like at its heart. One of them said, You'll know it when you stop asking. He was right. After a while, the dunes blur together, the sky becomes a mirror, and you realize the desert has no heart. It is the heart, beating beneath everything. Not all dangers come from thirst or heat. Bandits move like shadows here. They strike where the dunes narrow and the sand hardens. Once near the wells of Al-Qatif we saw smoke on the horizon, a signal meant for others. Haris ibn Marwan, our caravan master, ordered silence. We marched through the night without rest, leaving even the stars behind us. By morning the smoke was gone, and so were we. Haris is a man carved by years of wind. He speaks little, but every word seems weighed like gold. He knows the desert's moods, when it will rage, when it will rest. Some say he once lost a caravan and spent a month wandering alone before the sand gave him back. He never speaks of it. But when he looks at the horizon, I think he still sees ghosts walking there. Every caravan needs a man like Haris, someone who listens to silence. He reads the stars as others read scripture. When he lifts his hand, the whole line stops. When he lowers it, we move. No questions, no hesitation. Trust is the only currency that matters between life and death. I have also come to trust the camels more than men. They do not lie, they do not complain, they do not forget. They know the rhythm of the land better than any of us. When a storm is coming, they grow restless long before we see the clouds. When water is near, they raise their heads and hum softly. We follow their instincts, for in the desert, instinct is wisdom. Still, the journey wears on the spirit. After weeks of nothing but sun and dust, the mind begins to wander. Men start to talk in their sleep. Some whisper the names of wives they left behind. Others cry out for rain. Once I heard a man laughing softly in the dark. When I asked what was funny, he said, "I dreamt of grass." But there are moments of beauty too. Moments so pure they almost hurt. When dawn breaks after a cold night, and the dunes glow like bronze. When the wind pauses and the world becomes so still you can hear your own heartbeat. When you look up and see the Milky Way stretching from one horizon to another, and you realize that every grain of sand beneath your feet is older than the stars above you. Sometimes we reach an oasis, a few palm trees, a pool of clear water, birds flickering in the heat. It feels like a miracle. We drink, we wash, we sleep under shade for a day or two, but even paradise grows restless. The desert waits, and soon we must return to its silence. There are tales among the caravans, stories told in whispers by firelight. They say there is a place beyond the red dunes where the sand sings, at night. A valley that swallows sound. The well that shows your past instead of your reflection. I do not know if these stories are true, but I have seen enough to believe that the desert holds more than heat and emptiness. When a man dies out here, we bury him in the sand and mark the place with stones. The wind erases it within days. Yet I like to think that something of him remains, that the desert remembers every step, every breath, every prayer ever spoken beneath its sky. Tomorrow we leave Basra again, 12 camels, 8 men, and a road that disappears into the east. The merchants say it will be an easy journey, and it never is. But we go anyway, because the caravan always moves. It is what we are, the dust between destinations. Tonight, as the camp sleeps, I sit beside the fire and watch the flames bend toward the wind. The stars above me flicker like lamps in a temple. Somewhere beyond them lies the road we will walk. I listen to the silence one last time before we begin again, and I whisper, not to God, not to any man, but to the desert itself. Remember us kindly. The fire burned low, and dawn waited beyond the horizon. When the first light touched the sand, the caravan began to wake. The air was cool, almost gentle, but everyone knew it would not stay that way. Morning in Basra was the last mercy before the desert claimed the day. Men moved quietly between the shadows of tents. The sound of rope and wood filled the air. Knots being tightened, saddles adjusted, jars sealed with wax. The camels groaned softly, rising one by one like ships lifting from the tide. Their shadows swayed on the ground, long and wavering, like memories learning to walk again. Haris ibn Marwan stood at the front, silent as always. He wore a robe the color of dust, and a scarf wrapped tight across his brow. In his hand he held a small staff of polished tamarisk wood. More symbol than weapon, the mark of a man who led by presence, not by command. His eyes studied the horizon with patient certainty. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and dry. "It is time," he said. The words carried through the camp like wind through grass. No need for shouts or orders. Everyone knew what to do. The caravan was a single body, each man a limb, each camel a breath. When it moved, it did so with a rhythm born of repetition, trust, and necessity. Basra still slept behind them. Only a few fishermen stood by the river, watching as the long line of beasts and men disappeared into the gold of the rising sun. For a while the scent of salt water clung to the air, but soon it was replaced by dust. The dry, ancient smell of the world before rain. They followed the eastern road until the river bent away. The land flattened, cracked, and lost its color. There were no trees now, no houses, not even birds. Only the hiss of sand beneath their feet and the steady creak of leather. At midday they stopped beneath a lonely acacia, the only shade for miles. The men sat in silence, eating dates and bread. Sweat rolled from their foreheads, leaving small dark circles in the sand. The youngest among them, a boy from the coast, asked, "Why does the desert look the same in every direction?" Selm, the guide, smiled faintly. "Because it wants to confuse you," he said. "And because it can." Haris watched the boy for a moment, then pointed at the sun. "Learn to read its shadow," he said. "The desert hides its paths, but it cannot hide its light." When they moved again, the heat had sharpened. The air shimmered like glass. Every breath felt borrowed. The camel's hooves sank deep into the dunes, and each step sounded like a sigh. Selm walked ahead, his eyes never leaving the horizon. He was the only man who seemed at ease here. He carried no map, no compass, only the sky. At night he read the stars, but by day he watched the color of the air, the curve of the dunes, the way the wind combed through the sand. To him, these were letters in a book, older than any script. As the afternoon waned, a faint humming filled the air. The men looked up, thinking it was the wind, but Selm shook his head. "It is the sand," he said. "The dunes are singing." They listened. The sound was low, deep, like a drum buried beneath the earth. It rose and fell as they walked, a slow heartbeat that seemed to follow them. The boy crossed himself. Haris said quietly, "When the sand sings, it remembers." That night they camped in the hollow between two tall ridges. The wind dropped away completely. The silence felt so heavy that even breathing seemed loud. They ate little, bread, olives, and a small sip of warm water. No one spoke until Selm broke the stillness. "This land was once green," he said, "before the droughts, before the wars." One of the merchants laughed softly. "Old stories," he said. "The desert has always been the desert." Selm smiled. "Perhaps, but some say it waits to be forgiven." Later, when the others slept, Haris climbed one of the ridges alone. The stars were fierce and countless. He traced their shapes with his eyes. Suhal al-Turaya al-Kutub. Each one a marker, each one a companion. He thought of the caravans that had followed these same lights for centuries, and of the bones buried beneath the dunes that once dreamed of reaching the same distant cities. The wind rose gently, carrying the faint smell of resin and salt. Haris closed his eyes. The sound of the desert was the sound of time itself. The second morning brought wind, soft at first, then sharp. It came from the north, dry and full of dust. The sky turned pale. The dunes began to move. Fine grains of sand swirled around their feet like smoke. Selm raised his hand. "Storm coming," he said. They tightened their scars and pressed forward. For hours they walked through a world of blur and motion. The horizon vanished, the sky and ground became one color. The air tasted of iron. The men leaned into the wind, their robes whipping against their legs, their eyes half closed against the sting. The camels groaned but kept moving, their instincts stronger than fear. When the storm finally passed, the world was changed. The dunes had shifted. The landmarks were gone. Only the tracks of the caravan remain, a fragile thread across a sea of new sand. Haris looked around, scanning the shapes of the hills. Selm pointed to the east. "There," he said. "That ridge is the same. The road continues." Haris nodded. The caravan moved again, slower now, each step cautious, deliberate, reverent. That night they made camp in the shelter of a low rise. The men lay on their backs, exhausted, watching the stars tremble above them. No one spoke of fear. Fear was as constant as the sky. It needed no words. In the quiet, the boy from the coast whispered to Haris, "Why do we come here again and again?" Haris thought for a long moment. "Because the world is wide," he said softly, "and silence is a kind of truth." The boy nodded, not understanding, but he would in time. And when dawn came once more, the caravan rose and moved on. A long, slow line of shadows stretching across the glowing sand, disappearing into the great emptiness of the desert that remembers everything and forgives nothing. The next morning rose without sound. The air was heavy, and the light seemed different, paler, almost metallic. When the sun climbed, it brought no warmth. The red dunes had changed overnight, shaped by the storm into strange, unfamiliar forms. It was as if the land itself had shifted while they slept, rearranging its memory. The caravan began to move before dawn. The men were quiet, still weary from the storm. The camels plodded slowly, their feet sinking deep into soft sand. Every step stirred a thin red haze that hung low, refusing to lift. It felt as though the desert had closed in, wrapping them in a vast and endless silence. By midday, the horizon flickered again. Selm stopped at the crest of a dune and shaded his eyes. "There," he said softly, "something lies ahead." At first Haris saw only heat. Then, as the wind shifted, a shape began to form. A dark curve half buried in sand, and beside it the glint of metal catching the sun. They approached slowly. The wind moaned through the ridges, carrying a dry, hollow sound. When they reached the nearest rise, the scene unfolded before them. Wooden beams, broken wheels, a line of bones, long, pale, and still perfectly arranged in the shape of rest. It was a caravan, long dead. The men stood in silence. Even the camels stopped, their ears flicking nervously. The sand had preserved everything. The outlines of saddles, the remnants of cloth, a rusted dagger half buried near a skull. Haris dismounted and knelt beside it. The air around the bones felt cooler, as if the desert itself respected what it had taken. Selm crouched next to him. "They must have been caught by the wind," he said. Haris nodded. "Or they followed the wrong star." They searched carefully, saying nothing. Among the ruins they found water skins turned to leather, fragments of pottery, the blackened edge of a burned chest. Inside, wrapped in faded cloth, were coins. Byzantine, Persian, some from lands no one could name. The merchants stared, wide-eyed. One reached forward, but Haris stopped him with a look. "Leave it," he said quietly. "The desert gives nothing freely." A little further, Saif found a carved plaque of cedar. The writing was half gone, but a few letters could still be read. "In the name of the one who guides the winds." Selm traced the grooves with his fingertip. "Old Arabic," he murmured, "7th century, maybe earlier." "Before Basra," Harry said. "Yes, Sem replied. Before us all, they built a small cairn beside the bones, a circle of stones to mark the dead. Saif asked softly, "Do you think anyone remembers them?" Haris looked out over the dunes. "The desert does," he said. They stayed there until evening. No one could explain why, but none of them wanted to leave quickly. There was a feeling in the air, not fear, but recognition, as if the living and the dead were sharing the same road, just at different depths of time. When the sun began to fall, they prepared to move. Salm pointed to the east, where the light caught the edges of far-off hills. "Those are older dunes," he said. "They don't move much. We can make camp there by nightfall." Haris nodded, giving the order. As they walked, the wind rose again, gentle but persistent. It carried the smell of dust and something faintly sweet, like flowers long extinct. Behind them, the red light of sunset brushed the dunes in crimson. The bones of the lost caravan shone white in the dying sun, and slowly disappeared as the shadows grew. That night they camped at the edge of a shallow basin. The air was colder than usual, the stars seemed closer. No one spoke of what they had seen. The men ate quietly, their faces hidden by scarf and shadow. Haris sat apart, as he often did, watching the fire. The flames bent eastward, toward the direction they were heading. He wondered if the wind was guiding them, or warning them. Selm came to sit beside him. "They say this desert remembers every caravan that crosses it," he said. Haris smiled faintly. "Then it remembers too much." "Perhaps," Selm replied, "or perhaps memory is the only way it stays alive." Haris looked into the darkness beyond the firelight. The dunes gleamed faintly in the starlight, their shapes shifting and breathing like living things. He thought of the bones they had found, and of the prayer carved into the cedar plaque, "The one who guides the winds." He whispered it once under his breath, not as a plea, but as acknowledgement. In the distance, something howled, not human, not animal, but long and low, echoing across the open sand. The men froze, listening. Then silence again, thick and endless. Saif shivered. "What was that?" he asked. Haris said quietly, "The desert reminding us it's awake." They slept lightly that night. Dreams came like drifting sand, fleeting, formless. Some heard voices, others saw flashes of light beneath the dunes. Haris dreamt of a road of bones stretching into the stars, and of himself walking alone upon it, each step echoing like the strike of a drum. He woke before dawn. The air was still, so the stars were fading. He looked east, and for a moment, the horizon seemed to shimmer with shapes. A line of camels, distant, moving silently across the dunes. Then the wind stirred, and they were gone. When the others woke, he said nothing of what he'd seen. He only said, "We move early, the desert is watching." By the time the sun rose, the tracks of the lost caravan were already buried again. Only the memory remained, a story carried forward by another line of travelers, heading deeper into the same endless silence. Morning came without color. The horizon was pale, washed with gray, and the air carried the taste of dust. The caravan moved early, their steps slow but steady, the sound of hooves blending with the low hum of wind. Behind them, the memory of the lost caravan lingered like smoke. No one spoke of it, yet everyone felt its shadow, as if the desert itself had taken note of their passing. By midday, the dunes began to flatten. The sand turned lighter, and scattered across it were shards of black stone, smooth, polished by centuries of shifting wind. Selm paused to study them. "These are not from here," he said quietly. "Volcanic, from the western ridges, many days away." Horace frowned. "So how did they come to rest here?" Selm ran his hand through the sand. "The wind brings all things, in time." As they pressed on, the ground began to change again. Harder now, gravel beneath the sand. The color darkened from red to bronze, then to gray, and then, without warning, the dunes fell away into a vast hollow. The men stopped at its edge, staring. Below them lay the remains of walls. Not cliffs, not rocks. The walls made by hands long forgot. At first they thought it was a mirage, but the shapes held firm as they descended. The ground leveled into a wide plain scattered with pillars, broken arches, and the outlines of streets half buried in dust. A city silent and sunken, its heart long lost beneath the sea of sand. Haris dismounted slowly. His boots sank into the powdery earth with a soft sigh. The air was cooler here, as if the ruins still held the breath of a vanished world. He ran his fingers along a fallen column. The stone was smooth, carved with symbols no one could read. "Who built this?" Saif whispered. Selm's eyes glinted. "Older than our grandfather's grandfathers. Perhaps Sabaean, perhaps older still. Older than memory," Hari said. They walked through the empty streets. What had once been homes were now hollows filled with drifting sand. Fragments of pottery, pieces of bronze, a child's bracelet, green with age, all lay scattered like offerings. The silence was so deep that every breath sounded like a trespass. At the center of the ruins stood what remained of a temple. Its doorway was half buried, its walls carved with faint reliefs of figures with outstretched hands. In the dimness inside, the air smelled of salt and age. Light fell through a crack in the roof, illuminating the worn face of a statue. A woman, tall and veiled, her hands raised as if in warning or welcome. Selm bowed his head. "I've seen her before," he said softly, "in old scrolls. She was called Aluza, the protector of travelers." Haris studied the statue for a long time. Her stone eyes seemed to meet his own, empty yet aware, as if waiting for him to speak. He whispered, "Then protect us, still." Outside, the wind began to rise, swirling dust through the broken streets. The sound echoed between the stones like whispers. Some of the men turned sharply, thinking they heard voices, but there was only the hiss of sand sliding over stone. They made camp that night among the ruins. The firelight danced against the old walls, casting moving shadows over the faces carved there. It felt as though the city itself was watching. The merchants argued in hushed tones. "We should not stay here," one said. "This place was buried for a reason." Another answered, "Buried, yes, but also preserved. There may be treasure beneath." Haris raised his hand, and the talk stopped. "No digging," he said. "This city is already a grave." Later, when most of the men were asleep, Saif crept toward Haris's tent. "Master," he said quietly, "I heard something." Haris looked up from the small map he was sketching. "What did you hear?" "A voice," Saif said. "It called my name." Haris's gaze softened. "The desert plays tricks," he said. "Dreams echo louder in old places." But Saif shook his head. It was real. It came from below. But Haris stood and stepped outside. The night was still. The stars hung heavy above the ruined walls. He listened. Nothing, only the distant sigh of wind. Yet the air felt charged. A tension, a vibration underfoot, like the faint tremor of something vast turning in its sleep. They left the city at dawn. As they climbed the ridge beyond it, Haris looked back one last time. The morning sun touched the ruins, and for a heartbeat, it seemed as if light flared through the cracks in the temple walls, as if the city was waking. Then the wind blew, and the dunes shifted, and the city began to disappear again. Within hours it would be buried once more. When they stopped to rest that afternoon, Selm walked beside Haris. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. "I've heard it said that the desert hides its sins beneath the sand, that when men dig too deep, they uncover the memories of gods." Haris watched the horizon. "Then let us walk gently," he said, "for we walk on what they left behind." That night, The desert glowed faintly red under the rising moon, and though no one spoke of it, each man in the caravan felt a strange unease, a sense that the sand beneath them was not as still as it seemed. The ruins were behind them, but not forgotten. For many days the men spoke little, as if words might wake something still buried there. The desert stretched outward again, vast and bare, as if trying to swallow the memory of what they had seen. The wind came from the east now, warm, heavy, and constant. It brushed their faces with fine dust that clung to every fold of cloth. The dunes lost their red hue and turned a pale, ghostly gold. The land grew quieter, emptier. Even the air seemed tired. By the fourth evening, the waterskins had grown light. Every man knew it, though none said it aloud. They drank less. They moved slower. Their voices cracked when they spoke. Haris rode near the front, his eyes scanning the horizon for anything that shimmered differently. The curve of a hill, a darker patch of sand, any sign that might hint at water. Salm walked beside him, silent, counting steps under his breath. He was measuring distance, trying to recall where the next well might lie. But the desert changes faster than memory. When the sun sank that night, Haris gathered the men around the fire. The flame was small, its light weak in the wind. He said, "Tomorrow we reach the well of Al-Had. It should still hold water, it did when I was a younger man." A murmur of relief passed through the group. One of the merchants whispered, "If it's still there." Haris met his gaze and said simply, "It will be." They slept restlessly. Dreams came dry and feverish. Saif dreamed of the city beneath the sand, of the stone woman standing in her temple, her hands raised, her face turned toward the rising sun. When he woke, his throat ached with thirst. By noon the next day, the dunes began to change again. The sand grew coarser, mixed with gravel and stone. Low ridges appeared, black against the horizon. Salm lifted his staff and pointed. "There," he said, "the well lies beyond that rise." They climbed in silence. At the top, the desert opened before them, a wide basin surrounded by crumbling rock, and at its center, a circle of old stones. Though the well, the men cheered softly, too weak for real joy. They hurried down the slope. Haris followed slowly, watching. The stones around the well were ancient, carved with faint spiral marks half-worn by sand. He knelt and touched one. It was warm, almost alive. Selm lowered a rope with a tin cup tied to the end. He waited, listening, and it took longer than expected, a long fall into silence, before the faint splash came back up. Water. A wave of relief swept through the group. They filled their skins carefully, passing them from hand to hand like sacred objects. The water was cool, clear, and heavy, with the taste of metal. They drank slowly, savoring every drop. For a while, the desert seemed kind again. As evening fell, they made camp beside the well. The air felt different here, heavier, quieter, as if the place itself was listening. Saif sat near the edge, watching the wind play across the stones. Something about them unsettled him. The carvings seemed to shift in the fading light, their shapes flowing like water. He blinked, and they were still again. That night, when the stars rose, the men slept deeply for the first time in days. Only Haris and Salm stayed awake, their faces lit by the dying fire. Salm spoke first. "There is something wrong with this place," he said. Haris nodded slowly. "I know, but the men needed rest." Salm looked toward the well. "The wind doesn't touch it, have you noticed?" Haris followed his gaze. The sand drifted around the stones, but the mouth of the well was perfectly still. No dust, no movement. Just a dark circle that seemed to swallow light. When Haris finally slept, his dreams were not his own. He was standing at the edge of the well, looking down.
The water below was black, but in its depths he saw reflections, faces, shifting, countless. Some were his men. Others were strangers, and one was the stone woman from the buried city. Her eyes were open now. She raised her hands, and the water rippled outward, forming rings that turned into dunes, spreading across the desert like breath. He reached out, but when he did, her face dissolved into the darkness. He woke with a start. The fire was out. The camp was silent. The stars were dim behind a thin veil of dust. And from the well, he thought he heard something. Not wind, not water, but a faint hum, deep and steady, like the heartbeat of the earth. He rose and walked closer. The air grew colder with each step. The sound grew clearer. He leaned over the edge, but saw only blackness. When he dropped a small pebble, no splash came back. Only silence. He stayed there for a long time, listening to that strange, steady pulse. Then he whispered the same prayer he had spoken in the city. At dawn, the men woke refreshed. They felt their skins again, eager to move on. Saif knelt for one last drink. As he leaned forward, his reflection flickered. Not his face, but another's, a hollow-eyed man staring back from beneath the surface. He stumbled back, spilling his cup. What is it? Haris asked. Saif hesitated. Nothing, he said, only a shadow. They left soon after. The well stood silent as they went, the wind still refusing to touch it. As the caravan climbed the ridge beyond, Haris looked back one last time. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, as if something deep below had turned its gaze upward, watching them go. When the ridge hid it from view, he exhaled and said softly, "May it remember us gently." The caravan pressed onward, their figures small against the endless gold. Behind them, the well shimmered once more in the rising heat, then faded and was gone.
For 2 days they marched eastward, the dunes rising and falling like the slow breath of a sleeping giant. The wind was behind them now, soft but constant, as if pushing them onward. No one spoke of the well, but every man felt its presence still. That strange stillness that lingered behind them, the taste of its water heavy on their tongues. The desert changed again. The sand grew pale, and long streaks of white stone began to pierce the surface, like bones pushing through skin. Selm watched these carefully. "They mark an old road," he said. "The bones of the trade route." Haris nodded. "Which road?" "The one they called the Spine of Fire. It once carried incense and gold from Yemen to Syria, but it has been lost for centuries." They followed the trail of stone markers, each one smooth, curved, and half buried in sand. At first they appeared only once every hour, then more frequently, until they realized they were walking in the hollow of a great ancient path, cut deep into the desert by the passage of time. Selm's face lit with quiet wonder. "These stones are older than cities," he said. "They remember caravans greater than ours." The men felt it too, a strange sense of being part of something vast and old. Even the camels seemed to move differently, their steps steadier, as if recognizing a familiar rhythm. By nightfall, the road widened into a plain of flat rock. Here the wind carried no sand, and the air felt unnaturally still. The moon rose full, white as bone, spreading its light across the open ground. For the first time in many nights, the stars seemed to stand closer, like silent watchers on the edge of eternity. They made camp by a broken milestone, its surface carved with faint markings, a language no one could read. Selm traced it with his fingertips. "These were directions once," he murmured. "Now they lead only to silence." That night the men slept soundly, all but Haris. He lay awake, staring at the dark horizon. A faint line glowed there, pale and cold, as if moonlight reflected from something far ahead. He watched it until dawn, and when the first light came, he saw what it was. The road continued, not a path of stone, but a thin silver band of crushed glass.
stretching toward the east. She rose and woke Selm. What is that? Selm squinted against the light. Glass, maybe? Melted sand? Haris frowned. How? Lightning, Selm said. Or fire from the sky. The men followed it through the morning heat. The glassy road shimmered, reflecting the sun like water. It was beautiful and unsettling. Their footsteps rang faintly as they walked, as if echoing through an unseen chamber. By midday, Saif whispered, "It feels like someone else is walking with us." Haris said nothing. He felt it too. They taint rhythm of footsteps behind their own, just out of sync, as if another caravan was marching beside them, unseen but present. That night, when the wind fell quiet, they heard it clearly. The sound, low, distant, like the creak of leather and the groan of wood. Camels, but not theirs. The men froze, listening. The noise came from beyond the ridge. Footsteps, faint bells, and then slowly, fading away. Svam looked at Haris. The ghost trade route, he said softly. Those who walked it once never left. Haris gazed into the dark. Or perhaps we are the ghosts, walking where they already were. Sleep came uneasily that night. Them dreamed of long lines of travelers stretching across the stars, torches, moving like slow constellations. Others said they felt hands on their shoulders, guiding them forward when they stumbled. At dawn, they found fresh tracks beside their camp, camel prints. But there'd been no other caravans for hundreds of miles. The prints were deep, perfectly formed, and led eastward, in the same direction they were heading. The men grew quiet. No one wanted to be the first to ask if the desert could remember so vividly that it repeated itself. By midday, the sky darkened with clouds, the first in many weeks. The air smelled of rain, though none fell. Lightning flickered far to the south, a single bolt striking the horizon and lingering, burning a white scar into the distance. When the light faded, the glassy road glowed faintly where the bolt had struck, a path of fire that seemed to point forward. They marched until the heat broke. At sunset, they reached a rise overlooking a vast hollow. Below lay a stretch of blackened earth, smooth and glimmering like obsidian. Salm stared at it, his face pale. "This is no road," he whispered. "It's a scar." The ground below looked like something had passed over it, something immense, something hot enough to melt the world. The air shimmered with heat, though the sun was gone. No wind stirred. Even the camels refused to move closer. They camped on the ridge, uneasy, watching the hollow below. At night, faint lights flickered there, tiny blue sparks that danced for a moment, then vanished. Some said nothing. Haris did not sleep. He only watched, listening to the faint echo of bells drifting through the night. Just before dawn, she heard footsteps again, slow, heavy, measured. He turned and saw nothing, only the faint marks of sand shifting where no one stood. He whispered into the silence, "If you remember the way, guide us true." The wind rose gently, curling through the camp, and for the first time in many days, it carried the smell of rain. When the morning came, they followed the wind eastward once more, their shadows long and trembling on the glowing road, moving toward a horizon that felt closer and more infinite with every step.
For several days, the road led them east, its faint shimmer growing weaker under a thickening sky. The air grew heavy and strange, dense with the scent of iron and dust. Every breath felt borrowed, the horizon blurred, and even Selm, who never lost his sense of direction, began to frown at the shifting light. "The wind is changing," he said. Haris nodded. "It always does before the trial." That evening they stopped near a low ridge of stone. a place that offered little shelter but some illusion of safety. The men worked quickly, tying ropes, checking knots, covering the loads with leather sheets. They had learned the signs, the taste of static on the tongue, the distant tremble of sand, the eerie calm that comes before the desert decides to rise. The camels moaned softly, their bodies pressed close, sensing what was to come. The sky was the color of ash now, and the last light of the sun bled across the dunes in thin, broken lines. Then the first gust came, a whisper that turned into a scream. The storm rose from the horizon like a living wall. It rolled toward them, a mountain of dust and wind, its front edge curling and spinning with its own fury. "Circle the beasts," Haris shouted. Lay low, face away from the wind. The men moved with practiced precision. The storm struck moments later. Sound vanished beneath its roar. The air turned solid with sand, each grain cutting like glass, and the sky disappeared. There was only movement, endless, furious, blinding. They pressed together, backs bent, heads down, the world reduced to the small circle of breath around their mouths. The storm screamed for hours, a ceaseless voice neither of man nor of nature,
but of something older, something that had never forgiven the intrusion of the living. Haris felt the pull of the wind trying to drag him away. He dug his staff into the sand and held tight. Selm's cloak whipped free, vanishing into the red haze. The camels bellowed, their bodies shaking with exhaustion. And then came the thunder, not from the sky, but from beneath them. The ground trembled. The Haris felt it through his hands. A deep rolling vibration, as if something beneath the dunes was shifting in its sleep. He looked up, and through the wall of dust, he thought he saw movement, not the storm, but shapes within it. Tall, human, walking against the wind. He blinked, and they were gone. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time lost its meaning. The storm tore the world apart, and then slowly began to die. When the first light broke through the dust, the desert was unrecognizable. The caravan was scattered. The dunes had moved, burying everything familiar. The wind still moaned softly, as if mourning what it had undone. Haris rose slowly. His face was raw, his lips cracked, his eyes red from grit, and he looked around. Only silence. The camp was gone. The men were gone. Only Selm's staff lay nearby, buried in the sand. He dug it free, his hands trembling. The wind carried no voices now. He called out once, twice. No answer. Only the whisper of shifting sand. Hours later, he found the first survivor, Taif lying beneath the shadow of a dune, half covered, still breathing. Haris pulled him free, brushed the sand from his face, and gave him the last drops of water from his skin. Saif's eyes opened weakly. "Are we dead?" he asked. "Not yet," Haris said. They searched through the day, finding others. 2 merchants, both alive, one with a broken arm, and with nothing left but silence in his eyes. Of the rest, there was no sign. The storm had swallowed them whole. By nightfall, they had gathered what little they could. 3 camels, torn ropes, 1 intact skin of water. Selm was still missing. Haris stood atop a dune, watching the last light fade. In the distance, the sand glowed faintly red, as if fire still burned beneath it. He thought again of the shapes he had seen in the storm, the figures walking through the wind, unmoving, unbroken. He whispered, "Selm, if you live, find the road." The night that followed was cruelly cold. The survivors huddled close beneath a broken tarp, sharing warmth and silence. Above them, the stars were sharp as glass. The desert seemed to stretch forever, empty, yet alive. like a heart still beating beneath its own dust. Haris did not sleep. He sat apart, holding Selm's staff upright in the sand, a lonely marker for all that had been lost. He thought of the words Selm had spoken once, that the desert remembers its dead. He wondered now if it also remembered its living. At dawn, he climbed the nearest ridge. The sky was pale, and a faint wind whispered across the dunes. A calmer voice, almost kind. In the distance, he saw movement. Not men this time, but something gleaming. A line of stone markers stretching eastward. The old route. The ghost trade route had found them again. He called down to the others. Gather what you can, he said. The rose still remembers us. They rose slowly, stiff and hollow-eyed. But they followed him. The desert had tested them and spared them, barely. The wind had stripped away all but the essential. And in that silence, they began to move again, not out of hope, but out of duty, as if something unseen was guiding them forward. Behind them, the storm drifted farther east, a red wall fading into distance. Before them, the road shimmered faintly, like a thread of memory leading into the unknown. And so they walked, small figures in a world of endless sand, their shadows thin, their step slow, was unbroken. From the desert, watching seemed to breathe again.
For 3 days they followed the old road. It curved through low valleys of pale stone, rising and falling like a scar left by time. The air grew cooler as they walked, the wind gentler, the sky softer in color, as though the desert itself had decided to rest. The survivors moved slowly, their faces burned, their voices quiet. Each carried his thoughts the way a pilgrim carries his offering, something fragile, meant for no one else. Saif walked beside Haris, his steps uneven, his eyes distant. He spoke rarely now. When he did, it was in half-dreamed words. "Sometimes I hear them," he said. "The ones we lost." At the night, when the wind turns. Haris looked at him carefully. "The wind carries memory," he said. "It does not forget, it only changes its voice." That night they camped in the shadow of a tall ridge. The stars were clearer here, brighter, sharper, and yet somehow closer to the earth. The dunes around them glowed faintly in the moonlight, as if light were trapped beneath the sand. When dawn came, the wind shifted again, east to south, warm and fragrant, for the first time in weeks. The air carried the faint smell of life, moisture, vegetation, something green. Some would have called it a sign. By midday, the dunes broke apart. The land opened, revealing a hollow plain. At its center shimmered something impossible. A lake, still and bright, ringed with palms and white stone. An oasis. The men stopped and stared. None spoke. The air seemed to vibrate with disbelief. Even the camels hesitated, sniffing the wind, uncertain. Haris narrowed his eyes. "Is it real?" Saif nodded slowly. "It looks real." "So did the mirages," Haris said. But still he walked forward. The closer they came, the stronger the scent of water grew, cool and mineral, touched with the sweetness of reeds. They reached the edge, and Haris knelt, cupping the water in his hands. It was cold. He drank, and it was real. The others followed, falling to their knees, drinking, washing their faces, laughing softly through cracked lips. For a moment they forgot the weight of weeks. The sound of water against skin was almost holy. But as the sun began to lower, a strange quiet fell over the oasis. The birds that had been calling in the palms went still. The ripples on the lake slowed until the surface became perfectly flat. Saif was the first to notice. He pointed to the far side of the lake, asked to look. Across the water, the reflection of the palms wavered, and then began to move on its own. The mirrored trees bent in opposite directions, their shapes stretching like smoke. A ripple passed across the surface, but there was no wind. Haris stared. His pulse quickened, yet he felt no fear, only recognition. "The desert is remembering," he whispered. Selm's staff still hung from his shoulder. He planted it beside the water's edge. Its shadow fell long across the ground, and as it did, the reflection in the lake shifted again, that of palms, but of men. Rows of them, faint and translucent, walking in silence along an invisible road beneath the water. The men stepped back, crossing themselves, muttering prayers. Alis did not move. He watched the shapes pass, each one carrying something upon its back, each one moving with purpose. A caravan. "Ghost Road," Saif whispered. "The ones who never left." The reflections moved slowly toward the far horizon of the lake, their outlines fading as the sun sank lower. When the last figure vanished, the water grew dark again, and the sound of wind returned. That night, they built no fire. The oasis glowed faintly under starlight, the palms whispering like voices half-remembered. Haris sat apart, staring at the still water. His reflection stared back, but behind it, for just an instant, he thought he saw Selm's face. Calm, smiling, then gone. He whispered softly, "May the desert keep you." Sleep came slowly. Dreams rolled through them like waves, cool, deep, full of distant songs. In his dream, Haris walked again across the dunes, but this time they were white, not red. The air shimmered with music, low and endless, like the breathing of something eternal. He saw the city beneath the sand, the stone woman standing in her temple, her hands raised to the sky, and he understood then that nothing truly vanished here. Not men, not cities, not prayers. They only changed shape, folded into the vastness, becoming the memory of the desert itself. When morning came, the lake was gone. The palms stood still, their roots buried in dry sand. The air was empty, but the ground where the water had been was cool to the touch. Saif stood beside Haris, his face pale with wonder. "Did we dream it?" he asked. Haris looked toward the horizon, where faint clouds moved like smoke. "No," he said. "The desert dreams, and we walk inside it." They gathered what remained of their strength, picked their skins with sand for weight, and began to walk again. Behind them, the hollow shimmered faintly one last time in the heat. A ripple crossed the air, and for a heartbeat, the reflection of the oasis returned, perfect, bright, alive, and then was gone forever. The desert had remembered. Weeks passed. The road home was long and quiet. The dunes softened, the air grew heavy with the scent of salt, and the wind no longer sang. The survivors walked in silence, men made hollow by distance, carrying not goods, but ghosts. The desert behind them was vast and unmarked, as if everything that had happened there had been swallowed whole. And yet, in the stillness between footsteps, Haris thought he could still hear it, that faint low hum that was neither wind nor memory, but something deeper, like the heartbeat of the earth. By the time they reached the outskirts of Basra, the river's breath met them first. It carried the sound of water, the smell of reeds, the laughter of people who had never been lost. The noise felt almost painful after so much silence. The city's towers rose pale in the dawn. Fishermen worked along the shore, calling to one another, their voices bright and alive. The caravan entered without ceremony. No one noticed the weary men who once vanished into the desert. No one saw what they carried back. Not treasure, not spice, but the weight of what they had seen. Haris led the camels to the same square where the journey had begun. He dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate, as though each one closed a circle only he could see. He untied the last rope, they emptied the last skin, and stood for a long time in the dust. Saif stood beside him, thinner now, his face darker, older in the eyes. He looked toward the horizon, that endless pale line where land and sky met without promise. "Will we go again?" he asked. Haris smiled faintly. "Always," he said. "The road waits for those who remember it." He turned toward the boy, his expression unreadable in the morning light. "You know what the desert taught us?" Saif shook his head. "But nothing is ever lost," Haris said softly. "Every step remains. Every breath is recorded. Every silence is heard." He looked up at the sky. "The desert remembers. And so must we." They began to unload the camels. Traders came and went, counting bundles, weighing spices, talking of profit and routes and storms. But their words felt distant, unreal, like voices underwater. As the sun rose higher, Haris walked to the edge of the city wall. Beyond it lay the endless plain, a shimmer of light, a line of dunes, a horizon too bright to look at. He could almost see the shapes there again. The ruins, the red dunes, the ghostly caravans moving in silence. He closed his eyes and listened. The noise of Basra faded. For a heartbeat, the world was still, and in that stillness, he heard it, the sound that had followed him across all those miles. Not the storm, not the camels, not the voices of men, but the soft, eternal whisper of sand moving against sand. The desert was breathing, and in that breath, he felt it, recognition. When he turned back, the boy was waiting. "Naste," Saif said. "When people ask about the desert, what shall we tell them?" Haris smiled, his eyes reflecting the morning light. "Tell them the truth," he said, "that the desert is not empty. It is full of what we leave behind." He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Tell them it remembers." The wind rose from the east, carrying with it a faint whisper of heat and distance, the same wind that had once guided them out and now brought them home. Haris turned toward it, closed his eyes, and breathed deeply, as if to say farewell and greeting all at once. The boy watched him in silence. The noise of the city swelled behind them, markets opening, bells ringing, the life of those untouched by the desert's memory. But for a moment, everything seemed to pause. The air shimmered, and in that shimmer, it was as though the sand itself bowed to them, acknowledging, understanding, remembering. Haris opened his eyes and whispered the words. He had spoken so many times before. "Remember us kindly." Then he turned and walked back into the waking city.